engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious leaders, innovators, and people who are ready for the next level and beyond.
I'm again really excited to be with our good friend Jim M. Nicholson from PVS Chemicals, who's played a very influential story in the city of Detroit. And we want to spend some time today talking about how the city of Detroit, in going through its reinvention process, closely aligns with how associations in their role of going through reinvention. Jim is in a very interesting spot as he's been the chairman of Michigan Manufacturers Association for a number of years and has helped guide them through their reinvention process, and is also a key leader within the city of Detroit as the city of Detroit is going through its own reinvention process, both in a very interesting way, having a lot of very similar characteristics. Welcome, Jim, and thanks for being a part of this.
Mike, it's my pleasure to be here.
Jim, as you have been in the city of Detroit for a number of years, can you give some of our listeners just some background on how long PVS Chemicals has been in the city of Detroit and some of the role that your company has played historically in the city of Detroit?
Sure. Well, my grandfather started his business right here in the city of Detroit in 1945. So we are coming up on 70 years old. We have never left the city of Detroit, always been here. And we've seen some interesting times. I would tell you that as a city, the city of Detroit, it's no surprise to anyone, has seen a lot of challenges. There has been a lot of cultural turmoil and a lot of change. And it is an interesting time now as I think we're turning the corner and moving in the right direction. But as citizens of the city, we've been here a long time. We've been active in both the civic and the political parts of the things that go on here at the city. And we live it because this is our home. We have well over 250 people work here in the city of Detroit. And their livelihood and the livelihood of many others depend on us doing a good job and depend on our participation within the city.
Jim, why did your family locate this company here 70 years ago?
Well, I would tell you that it was more luck than skill. There was a piece of property available, and the city of Detroit was an industrial town. You might remember, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was the heyday for U.S. manufacturing. And Detroit was the home for automobile manufacturing and the home for what we call chrome plating. And chrome plating at the time involved dissolving chrome in acid and using electroplating technology to plate that acid on, or that chrome on steel. A fascinating process, but used a lot of the stuff we sold. So we went to the customers, and we've been here ever since.
So Detroit as a manufacturing hub became the logical place for a company like PVS Chemicals to be rooted and to develop the success that it has.
Absolutely. You've got to be where your customers are.
And Jim, as you've had a chance to lead this company through its many challenges to the success that it currently has, you've watched the city of Detroit go through a similar set of challenges and circumstances as the city in its growth from the 1900s to the 1940s and 50s to its peak as a manufacturing dynasty, but more importantly, the birth of the middle class and a opportunity for a population of people to economically have achieved a high degree of success. And then sometime after that peak, there were some changes that began to take place. And the city was no longer at its peak operational capacity any longer. Can you talk about that time period and what you started to observe as a leader within the city?
Well, I would say the changes that occurred probably happened a little before my time, the what I would call the peak and the change. But I can tell you what I've seen. And so what I've seen is a city that moved from being a city that worked to a city that didn't quite work as well for its citizens, to a city that didn't work well at all for its citizens. And the easiest way to demonstrate that is to look at the population trends. You can look at a city that is 157 square miles and that had 2.1 million people. And today, we're the same square miles, but we have 680,000 or so. The number is always in dispute, but that's in the ballpark. And, that tells you that, 1.3 million people, maybe 1.4 million people, decided to vote with their feet. And if you look at the greater Detroit area, so beyond just the city limits of the city itself, Detroit's actually a very prosperous and very vibrant community. But when you go to within the city's borders, you can see where an organization failed to compete for its citizens. And other communities got those citizens and their tax dollars.
And so as you look to the city now more recently, where let's go now look at the last perhaps 10 years, I think you're going to start to tell me that the city is starting to understand it must behave differently in order to stop the cultural trends that you began to identify when the citizens started to vote with their feet and leave this city.
So I think that, within the last 10 years, we've seen the bottom, right? The challenges of the Kilpatrick administration, the challenges of the constant outflow of people, the ongoing challenges in the education system, they all got enough attention, and they got enough people to say enough is enough. And the reality for many citizens of Detroit these days is they can't afford to leave. So political change is their only option. Before, there were options. But today, the majority of the folks who live here are in an economic situation where their assets are here, their loyalties are here, they enjoy the cultural experience that's here, or they have no other option, they can't move.
Jim, for most people, even though enough may be enough, they really don't have the ability to make significant change like certain key leaders like yourself can make. At what point, even though enough is enough, at what point do key leaders really need to make the kinds of decisions that allow the city or a business or an association to stop with the old and start with the new?
Well, I think Detroit, in some cases, is a special case. But with any organization, it's when the key leaders decide that you've hit bottom, that radical change needs to happen. And making that decision could have been made 10 years ago, could have been made 5 years ago. But in the case of municipalities, its political leadership has the final say in how the outcome happens. And I would say that the prior administration, the Bing administration, and the governor's office all saw that there wasn't a path beyond some really radical change. And the city still had a lot of cultural momentum resisting that. There is, as you would find with any organization that's 300 years old, and Detroit was over 300 years old this year, there is a tremendous amount of inertia that happens. And whether that's in union contracts or the way city services are provided or the investment in computers or the way that we deliver services, these things, again, the population voted with its feet. It left. It didn't feel like the services provided were a value for money. But the political inertia kept it from changing. And there are many arguments that you could make that say Detroit was bankrupt a decade ago. But the political leaders at the time finally found the guts to say, you know what, we need to make this change happen. And they did. And what it did for the community was change the paradigm. And to that I give credit both to the governor and the mayor and the prior mayor. And as well, I would give some credit to the bankruptcy judge and the bankruptcy process, and the emergency manager. There's some credit to go around in terms of thinking about how things change. But in terms of leadership, the organization of the city, still politically led, does need input from the people who have investments in the community. And I think that when you think about the input that folks ask for, they're not asking, how do I improve fire service? They're asking, what are the priorities? What matters? How are we going to make the impact material for the citizens of our city? And that's really where leadership within the city matters. It is not that we're going to be able to influence policy outcomes. Policy outcomes are going to be influenced by the voters.
That makes up a very important point, Jim, and you mentioned this, and I want to go to it a little bit, and that is that everyone has a place, whether you're a citizen and how you vote with your feet, and the role of the voting citizenship versus the role of key leaders. A lot of press, most recently, Jim, has gone to the new people in Detroit who have brought new momentum, outside capital, have made some significant investments. And now, in fact, instead of talking about certain people, we can even start talking about certain countries who are now starting to make those kinds of investments. But your company's been here all along, Jim. Your company, at 70 years old, has seen and been through quite a bit. Can you talk about how, even though everyone has a different role in the reinvention process, in this case the municipality and the city of Detroit, but how everyone in their own special role needs to do well in their own special role?
Well, I think that's true. I think there's when folks come to town, they're going to see some great parts of town and some serious new growth. They're going to see up and coming areas. So, the first I would call would be the Woodward Corridor. The second maybe the Jefferson East Corridor and Palmer Woods. These are all areas where there's investment happening, where there's real growth opportunity. But Detroit is gigantic, 157 square miles, and there isn't enough money to fix it all at once. We didn't get in this hole over a decade or so. It took us multiple decades to get here, and it's going to take multiple decades to come out. That said, those of us who are, let's say, out of the popular areas still have a meaningful place and a meaningful part in the reinvention of town, because we are focused on the core things that a city must deliver. And that is fire protection, public safety, and the services that are traditionally done by a municipality, trash pickup, that type of thing. The way for the city to tell they're doing well is to look at these outlying areas and say, how are we doing? Are we providing the services beyond what I would call the newly invested in? And, there the opportunity is greater. The opportunity is longer term. The opportunity is more expensive and less sexy. But if we are going to grow back to 1 million or 1.5 million people, we're going to have to be able to effectively provide services beyond the border of the newly invested in.
You bring up such interesting thought, and that is that, yes, the focus today is kind of on the core of Detroit, downtown, and we have some investments that we can actually take you to that look and feel, and you can actually participate in, and actually understand a little of how this core reinvention is beginning to start. But what I'm hearing you say is the real test of pure reinvention is if you've been able to build momentum to take that core and start to create meaningful change in the outlying areas past the core.
Exactly right. So you're the challenge for the city today is that of the residents who are here, the vast majority don't live in what I would call the reinvented space. And they will still vote with their feet, given the opportunity. They pay higher taxes than the surrounding cities. They get fewer services than the surrounding cities. And they're going to continue to leave if we aren't able to provide them a better value proposition. So from a reinventing government standpoint, and I think the mayor is doing an excellent job of staying focused on this, is we must be able to show our citizens that when they dial 911, they'll get service, whether that's police, fire, or EMS, that their trash will be picked up on a regular basis, that code will be enforced, that blighted buildings will be knocked down, and that their quality of life will be supported as opposed to inhibited by city services.
Now, we've talked about the importance that key leaders have in the reinvention process, and certainly within the core, we understand there have been some ways in which you even have identified the core key leaders who started the reinvention process and started the opportunity to build more momentum and radiate out. How do you see, Jim, the role of this next group of leaders outside of the core who must accept the role of leadership to make happen the vision of building municipal services, having reliable water sources, having all the things that will allow people to come back? What is the role of that next ring of leaders surrounding this core in having that become a reality?
So I would say that the role of the leaders outside of the core is about having a realistic vision. Detroit is a big city, and each of its neighborhoods has its own advantages and disadvantages. And whether we talk about the Lower East Side Action Plan or the reinvention of the state fairgrounds or all the positive things that are happening in Southwest Detroit, I think that each of these areas has its own focus, has its own opportunities. And the leadership in each of these areas needs to understand how best to make their area attractive to others. Because if the city's going to grow and thrive, it has to be able to be attractive to a broad cross-section, just like every other city in this nation, of income streams.
Now, what you're describing is there's no one right answer to how this reinvention process is going to take shape. Having been directly involved in the old state fairgrounds, which is, I believe, would be more at the northern end of the city limits.
It is.
And now knowing that it's been repurposed in a very different way, I almost think, now you haven't said it, so I want to make sure it's really clear to the people who are listening to this. In the reinvention process, there is no specific blueprint. Each individual opportunity has to be allowed to find its special, attractive place for whatever you're measuring, in this case, a population growth.
Exactly. And I think that the reality for every neighborhood in this city is that it competes both with every other neighborhood in this city and the neighborhoods outside. And we have to understand, as we look at each neighborhood, where it fits in that broader marketplace. And so when you ask about Jefferson East, which is the area along the waterfront, and you say, well, what is its opportunity? Well, its opportunity is pretty great. If you think and compare it to waterfronts across the country and across the world, there is a lot of very low cost, very valuable real estate along that river. And it has the opportunity to be a very dynamic and vibrant set of neighborhoods. That said, that's a very different opportunity than the one on the southwest side, which is primarily ethnic, which has got a family cohesive culture. And there we're talking about rebuilding housing stock and filling in. We're not talking about a fundamental change in neighborhood. Now, that said, you go to the northeast or northwest side, and you start asking, well, here We have a number of blighted blocks, we have abandoned facilities. What is the proper and best use of a neighborhood that maybe has lost a lot of its cohesiveness? And how do we make it attractive to urban homesteading, to a different kind of pioneer who is going to have a different kind of experience from the city than the other two neighborhoods we discussed, and certainly a different kind than one that's being perceived of downtown?
So it appears to me that the role initially in a new space, as we're repurposing some of these neighborhoods, is there's a role for a leader to create this vision, kind of understand what this unique opportunity is, and start to create a new culture of attraction to bring a population back. But Jim, how do we find those new leaders? How do we start to recruit those new board members onto the boards and these new leaders within these neighborhoods? And how do we engage them and enthuse them? How do we teach this next group of people who play vitally important roles in this process to take on that role, because as you and I both know, leadership is not for everyone. How do we really enthuse this next group of people to own this unique vision and to then create a sustainable attraction for this neighborhood?
Well, I think the voters of Detroit have started that already by voting in a leader in the mayor who is active and out front and interested in making things happen. And that I think was the key start to the process, because the mayor is then out looking for leaders in the neighborhoods to make the next step happen. I think the great challenge for leaders in all these neighborhoods is to consider the vision, consider the urban plan, work within the mayor's office to make sure that that plan gets some blessing so that we're not at cross purposes. And when you have so many people, it's easy to get there. To have that leader has to have some community links. They have to be credible to the community. If they're not credible to the community, then no matter what they propose, it will not go forward. But I think the final thing, and I think one of the things that's a big trap for leaders, is to get caught up in the real estate and lose sight of the vision. So there's a real challenge for folks to think about investing dollars in real estate or in job training when the investment really ought to happen in planning and setting up the plan, and let the market make the investments in the real estate and the job training.
You really bring up a very interesting thought, and that is that there's only a certain amount of resource that we have available to us, and we tend to think of it in terms of financial, which allows us to buy real estate, which allows us to hire people. But if we were to take that energy and convert that to time, or convert that to intensity, or convert that to intention, what you're saying is the intention of what those leaders should be creating is probably a better investment of energy in achieving a sustainable difference as opposed to purchasing turf.
Exactly. We cannot be too paternal in this process. Right? The market will decide in the end what will happen in every single one of these neighborhoods. And it is our role as leaders to try to create the conditions where people want to make investments. And whether those people are the neighbors. So for example, the mayor's current process of allowing neighbors to buy the plots next door to them is an excellent process because it invests people in the city. But those kinds of things need to happen. So if people are interested in providing a set of circumstances for their particular community that will involve promoting retail along a certain section of a street, well, it isn't buying and rehabbing the facilities there. It's about getting the attention of the city so that there is a agreed upon plan, that there's a reduction in time to get permitting, that there's a marketing strategy for that space, so that the entrepreneurs of the world know it's there and take the opportunity to invest in town. There isn't enough money, whether it's state, federal, or local, that can do all of the investments that Detroit needs. We're going to need to make the marketplace come to us. And we're going to need to be attractive enough to do that. So we have to be an easy place to build a house, to do business, and there we still have a fair amount of cultural momentum to overcome.
That's a very interesting alignment with our work with associations, which is we have to make it easy for people to invest in our city. Just like I'm absolutely positive you're going to tell me that the association must make it easy for a potential new member to understand the benefit to being a part of that association. And it's so fundamental in its thought, and so yet sometimes so difficult to put into practice, that you've really helped, Jim, in our time today, kind of understand and clarify some thought. And I want to go through some of those thoughts because they're absolutely incredibly important in how we think about pure reinvention, whether we're talking about a municipality, whether we're talking about our own career or life, or whether we're talking about an association. But that is, Jim, you started out talking about the long-term commitment, that we didn't get here today and we won't end up where we need to be tomorrow, that we need to be in this for the long haul, and that we have to really understand what we're using as a measurement. In the case of the city of Detroit or within its surrounding areas, it's the citizen base, the people who are voting with their feet. In other examples, we would have to find other measurables, whether it's an association's growth in membership, whether it's in a political process, we have a way in which we can vote. But we have to recognize that there is a way to understand what the momentum is and how we then start to shift the momentum into a different direction. That at some point, whether you're in a business or whether you're in a municipality, you do get to the defining point that enough is enough. In the case of Detroit, enough is enough, and finally, really enough is enough was when the bankruptcy was finally, which was not an easy process for anyone to understand was necessary. There were some very difficult decisions made by some key leaders in order to initiate that process. But in the end result, it goes back to what you said, is that there was the understanding that enough was enough. And for there to be responsible change going forward, the rules of the game would have to start changing in order to allow the city to have its opportunity going forward. That understanding priorities is critically important in how you create that momentum, and that momentum, again, is decades in either the making one way or another. Probably one of the more significant thoughts was your thought about having a realistic vision. I think sometimes leaders get into a problem where their vision may be unrealistic to the people who are listening to it. And I think people quickly sort out whether there's any reality to a certain thought. And the closer towards reality people can see their own reality in that vision, I believe you're encouraging, then that's where the true connection has an opportunity to take place, because that more unique vision is so realistic that I can actually see myself behaving it or participating in it. And it's okay if it's different from one community to the next. It's okay to be different from one association to the next. It's in understanding what your unique opportunity is, or your unique characteristics are, that allow you to build something very special with who you are, not trying to build something off of who you are not. And I think that becomes critical. It's an interesting lesson in the city of Detroit, because the city of Detroit does not have the kind of weather that other cities may have that may attract people in for a convention. It doesn't have certain things that perhaps key cities have in terms of low airfare or certain other areas. But it does have something very significant here, and that is the opportunity to learn firsthand how reinvention and these things that you're talking about are critically important. And then finally, and this is the one that's really captivated me, and that is that we only have so much energy to give, whether it's financial energy, whether it's intellectual energy, and understanding that with whatever energy you have to invest in the reinvention process, Jim, as you've discussed, it probably is more important to us to invest that energy into things which will make a critical difference, which are not going to be things like real estate or brick and mortar, but are actually going to be the energy of the vision, the uniqueness, and the ability for people to connect to that so that that population can attract back in to allow it to participate in this new place that we're calling Detroit or its surrounding cities.
Detroit has made remarkable changes over the last 5 years, and I look forward to the next 5 years because I think those things are all happening. They're all happening at different paces. So I think it'll be a great experiment, and I think it'll be something for people to see.
If you're an association meeting planner, or if you're an association executive interested in reinvention, Detroit is the place to be. Make sure you check out our website, www.purereinvention.com. Follow us on Twitter. And Jim, thank you very much for the time you have invested in sharing your thoughts on the city of Detroit with us today.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new episodes are available by following us on Twitter @PureReinvention or sign up for our mailing list at PureReinvention.com.